Don't start the engine. Homeless kid warned a biker. What he found out next was shocking. And Hell's Angel response shocked everyone. The roar of a Harley-Davidson is usually the last thing a person hears before trouble starts. But for Raymond Callahan, that sound was supposed to be his ticket home. He didn't know that a shadow was watching from the mouth of a nearby alley. A shadow in a tattered hoodie with eyes that had seen too much for a 12-year-old. While the Hells Angels were inside grabbing supplies, two men with covered faces moved like ghosts through the parking lot. One knelt by the lead bike, his hands moving with a terrifying precision, sliding something small and metallic deep under the leather seat. They were gone before the neon sign above the door could even flicker. The boy, Miguel, stood frozen. He'd lived on these streets long enough to know the difference between a mechanic and a murderer. When the heavy glass door of the convenience store swung open and the bikers stepped out, laughing and clanking in their leather armor, Miguel didn't think about the danger to himself. As the leader swung a heavy leg over the bike and reached for the ignition, Miguel sprinted. His bare feet hit the oil-stained asphalt hard. "Don't start it," he screamed, his voice cracking against the wind. "Don't start the engine. I hear it. I hear the tick-tock." What happened next would change the history of the Oakland charter forever. But before we get into the heart of this incredible story, I want to know who is riding with us today. Drop a comment below and tell me which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories of brotherhood and survival travel. To understand why a homeless kid would risk his life for a man most people would cross the street to avoid, you have to understand Miguel Hernandez. For Miguel, the world was a series of vibrations and sounds. When you live in the cracks of a city like Oakland, you don't look at things, you listen to them. You listen for the heavy tread of a police officer's boot, the click of a car door locking as you walk by, and the specific, hollow sound of an empty stomach. Miguel and his mother, Maria, were ghosts in a land of plenty. Maria had brought him across the border years ago, chasing a dream that had slowly turned into a daily battle for oxygen. They didn't have papers, which meant they didn't have voices. They moved from shelters to basements, always one step ahead of the shadows. That night, Miguel had been scavenging for something as simple as a discarded granola bar near the convenience store. He'd seen the Hells Angels pull up before. They were loud, they were terrifying, and they were the only people in the city who didn't look down on him. Mostly because they didn't look at him at all. To them, he was just part of the landscape. But Miguel saw them. He saw the way they moved like a pack, a brotherhood that didn't need permission to exist. He envied that. He envied the way they owned the air around them. So, when he saw those two strangers in the hoodies, men who didn't smell like grease and old leather, but like something cold and clinical, he knew the balance of the street had been tipped. He watched from behind a dumpster as they planted the device. He heard the faint, rhythmic snip-snap of wires being tucked away. And then he heard it. That sound that haunts his dreams now. Tick, tick, tick. When Raymond Callahan, the president of the local charter, felt the small, trembling hand of a barefoot boy grab his chrome handlebars, his first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was a flash of ironclad authority. You don't touch a Hells Angels bike. It's more than a machine, it's a throne. But the look in Miguel's eyes stopped the roar in Callahan's throat. It wasn't the look of a kid looking for a handout. It was the look of someone who had seen the Reaper leaning against the gas pump. "Step back, kid." One of the other bikers, a man named Marcus with arms the size of Miguel's torso, growled. "No," Miguel yelled, his voice trembling, but his feet planted. "Under the seat. I saw them. They put something under the seat, and it's talking. It's ticking." The silence that followed was heavier than the bikes themselves. Callahan looked at the boy, then at the seat of his prized Harley. He didn't dismiss him. You don't survive 3 decades in a motorcycle club by ignoring the warnings of the street. He signaled his men. "Check it," he said, his voice a low rumble. 2 bikers, Derek and a woman named Lena, who had ink running up her neck like vines, moved in. They didn't use tools. They used the cautious grace of bomb disposal experts. When Lena clicked on her flashlight and peered into the guts of the bike, her breath hitched. "Ray," she whispered, "get back. Now." They found it. A professional-grade explosive, wired to the ignition. If Callahan had turned that key, he wouldn't have just died. He would have been vaporized, along with anyone within 20 feet. The realization hit the group like a physical blow. These were men and women who lived on the edge, but this wasn't a fair fight. This was an assassination. Callahan didn't look at the bomb. He looked at Miguel. The boy was shivering now, the adrenaline leaving his small frame. He looked tiny standing next to the massive machines. Callahan knelt down, a gesture his brothers hadn't seen him make in years. He was at eye level with a kid who smelled like the street and had dirt under his fingernails. "What's your name, son?" "Miguel," the boy whispered. "Miguel," Callahan repeated, the name sounding heavy in the midnight air. "You have any idea what you just did?" Miguel shook his head. He just wanted the ticking to stop. Callahan reached into his heavy leather vest and pulled out a roll of bills. It was more money than Miguel had seen in his entire life. Hundreds of dollars. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "This is for tonight." But it isn't enough. Not even close. But as the police sirens began to wail in the distance, Callahan knew that by saving his life, Miguel had just put a target on his own back. The men who planted that bomb weren't the type to leave witnesses. They were the East Bay Riders, a ruthless gang trying to claw territory away from the Angels. And if they found out a homeless kid had ruined their masterpiece, they wouldn't just be angry. They'd be lethal. Callahan looked at his brothers. He saw the conflict in their eyes. Marcus was already looking around, scanning the shadows, his hand resting near his belt. Lena was looking at Miguel with a soft, pained expression. They knew the rules of the club. You look after your own. But was this kid their own now? "We can't leave him here," Lena said, her voice firm. "He's a witness, Ray," Marcus countered, his voice like grinding stones. "If we take him in, we're bringing the heat right to our doorstep. We give him the cash, we tell him to run. That's the street." Callahan stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over Miguel. He looked at the convenience store, then at the dark alleys that branched off like veins into the heart of Oakland. He knew those alleys. He knew that for a kid like Miguel, there was no place to run that the shadows wouldn't find. "He stays with us," Callahan declared. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The walk to the apartment where Miguel and Maria were staying was the longest 10 minutes of Miguel's life. He led the way, with the low rumble of 5 Harleys following him like a slow-moving thunderstorm. He was terrified of what his mother would say. Maria lived in fear of the light. She wanted to stay in the dark where it was safe. Bringing a parade of bikers to their door was the opposite of safe. When they reached the dilapidated auto shop where Maria was waiting in the upstairs loft, the look on her face was pure terror. She saw the leather, the patches, the tattoos, and she immediately thought the worst. She grabbed Miguel, pulling him behind her, her Spanish coming out in a frantic, protective torrent. Callahan stepped forward, removing his sunglasses even though it was night. He showed her his hands, open and empty. "Ma'am," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Your son just saved my life. And because of that, he's in danger. I'm Raymond Callahan. And as long as I'm breathing, nothing is going to happen to your boy." Maria didn't know who the Hells Angels were in the way the newspapers did. She just saw men with scars and hard eyes. But she also saw the way Miguel was looking at Callahan, with a strange, flickering sense of awe. That first night in the safe house, an apartment the club owned above a garage, was the first time Miguel had slept on a mattress in 6 months. But he didn't sleep well. Every time a car passed, or a dog barked, he saw the face of the man kneeling by the bike. He saw the tattoo on the man's neck, a jagged black crow. The next morning, the reality of the situation began to set in. The clubhouse was in an uproar. Word had traveled fast. The East Bay Riders had tried to take out the president, and they had failed because of a street rat. That was the term Marcus used. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was being a realist. The club was built on a code of secrecy and brotherhood. Bringing an undocumented woman and her son into the inner circle was a violation of everything they stood for. "We're not a charity, Ray," Marcus argued in the kitchen of the apartment while Maria made coffee for everyone. She was trying to be useful, trying to earn her keep, her hands shaking as she set the mugs down. "The riders are going to come for him. They have to. If they let a kid slide, they look weak. We're inviting a war into our house for someone who hasn't even been patched." Lena slammed her hand on the table. "He's a kid, Marcus. He did more for this club in 5 seconds than half the prospects have done in 5 years. He heard a tick that we were too loud to hear. He's got ears, he's got heart. We don't turn our backs on heart." Miguel listened from the hallway. He felt that familiar weight in his chest, the feeling of being a problem to be solved. He looked at his mother, who was staring at the floor, her shoulders hunched. They were used to being unwanted. They were used to people debating their value. But then Callahan spoke, and the room went silent. "I remember what it's like to have nothing," Callahan said. He wasn't looking at Marcus or Lena. He was looking at the coffee in his mug. "I remember being 17 and thinking the world was just a place designed to crush me. A man named Thomas gave me a chance. He didn't ask for my papers. He didn't ask if I was worth the trouble. He just saw a human being in the rain and opened the door. I'm opening the door." He looked up, his eyes locking onto Miguel in the hallway. "You want to be a ghost, Miguel? Or you want to be someone who stands his ground?" Miguel stepped out into the light of the kitchen. "I'm tired of running," he said. Callahan nodded. "Good. Because the East Bay Riders are already looking for you. We found one of their scouts circling the block an hour ago. They know you're here, and they're not coming to talk." The tension in the room was electric. The Hells Angels were used to being the predators, not the protectors of the vulnerable. But as Derek started checking the locks and Lena began scrolling through security feeds on her laptop, the dynamic shifted. They weren't just a motorcycle club anymore. They were a fortress. But a fortress is only as strong as its weakest point. And as Miguel looked out the window at the gray Oakland skyline, he saw a black car idling at the end of the street. It didn't have its lights on. It just sat there, like a predator waiting for the sun to go down. The war hadn't just begun. It was sitting on their doorstep, and Miguel was the prize. The black car at the end of the street didn't move for 3 hours. It sat there like a gargoyle, dark windows reflecting the dingy gray of the Oakland afternoon. Inside the apartment, the air was thick with the smell of motor oil from the garage below, and the sharp, spicy scent of the Kiloquils Maria was making in a desperate attempt to stay busy. Every time the floorboards creaked, she jumped, her eyes darting to the heavy steel door. She didn't understand the politics of the street, but she understood the look on Raymond Callahan's face. It was the look of a man preparing for a storm. Callahan stood by the window, his massive frame partially hidden by the curtain. He wasn't looking at the car. He was looking at the way the street was behaving. The neighborhood was too quiet. The usual pushcart vendors were gone. The kids who played soccer against the brick wall across the street had disappeared. The street knew something was coming. "They're testing us," Derek said, leaning against the kitchen counter while he cleaned under his fingernails with a pocket knife. "They want to see if we're actually going to hunker down for a kid. They think we're bluffing. They think eventually we'll get bored or hungry and hand the boy over so we can get back to business." Marcus grunted from the sofa, where he was cleaning a heavy chrome wrench. "If they think that, they don't know Ray. But they're right about one thing. This isn't business. This is a drain. We've got 3 shops to run and a shipment coming in from Reno on Friday. We can't sit here forever playing nursemaid." "We aren't playing nursemaid, Marcus," Lena snapped, her eyes never leaving the tablet screen where she was monitoring a hidden camera the club had installed near the alley. "We're holding the line. If we let a gang like the East Bay Riders dictate who we protect, we might as well turn in our patches and start a knitting circle. This is about respect." Miguel sat at the small wooden table, his hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice. He felt like he was watching a movie of his own life, a spectator to a war that was being fought over his very existence. He looked at the leather vest Callahan had draped over a chair. The Death Head logo, the winged skull, seemed to be staring at him. "Why do they want me so bad?" Miguel asked, his voice small. "I'm just a kid. I didn't see their faces. I only saw the tattoo." Callahan turned away from the window, his eyes softening as they landed on Miguel. "It's not about what you saw, Miguel. It's about what you represent. You're a witness to their failure." That bomb was supposed to be their announcement, their way of telling the world that the Hells Angels are old, slow, and ready to be replaced. But you made them look like amateurs. In their world, that's a death sentence. If they let you live, it means the Hells Angels have the power to protect even the smallest person from them. They can't have that. Suddenly, Lena's tablet chirped. "Heads up. 2 more cars just turned the corner. Same make, no plates. They're boxing us in." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The casual banter died. Derek snapped his knife shut. Marcus stood up, the wrench in his hand looking like a lethal weapon. Callahan didn't panic. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any sudden movement. "Maria, take Miguel into the back room," Callahan ordered. "Get in the bathtub and stay low. Do not come out until I tell you. No matter what you hear." Maria grabbed Miguel's arm, her face a mask of pure terror. She didn't argue. She dragged him into the small, windowless bathroom and pushed him into the cast-iron tub, covering him with her own body and a pile of thick blankets. Miguel could hear her whispering prayers in Spanish, her heart beating against his back like a trapped bird. In the living room, the world exploded. It started with a brick through the window. Shards of glass sprayed across the room, glittering like diamonds in the dim light. Then came the sound of gunfire, not the heavy roar of a shotgun, but the rapid, frantic pop-pop-pop of small-caliber handguns. "Down!" Callahan roared. Miguel pressed his face into the cold porcelain of the tub. He heard the heavy thud of Derek returning fire, the booming echo of a larger weapon that shook the very walls of the apartment. He heard shouting in the street, the screech of tires, and then the sound of the front door being kicked. The heavy steel door held for a second, then the hinges groaned. Miguel heard Marcus let out a roar that sounded more animal than human. There was a sound of scuffling, boots on wood, the heavy impact of bodies hitting the floor. "You want the kid?" he heard Marcus yell. "Come and get him through me, you cowards." The fight was short but brutal. The East Bay Riders weren't soldiers. They were street thugs used to intimidating people who couldn't fight back. They weren't prepared for the Hells Angels. They weren't prepared for men who treated a fight like a religious experience. After what felt like an eternity, the gunfire stopped. The only sound was the ringing in Miguel's ears and the heavy, ragged breathing coming from the living room. "Ray." Lena's voice sounded strained. "I'm good," Callahan grunted. "Derek." "Caught a graze on the arm, but I'm upright." Marcus handled the 2 that came through the door. "They won't be walking for a while." Miguel felt his mother's grip loosen. She sat up, her eyes wide and wet with tears. They waited in the bathtub for another 5 minutes until the bathroom door creaked open. Callahan stood there. He was covered in drywall dust, and there was a smear of blood on his cheek that wasn't his. "It's okay," he said, reaching a hand down to help Miguel out of the tub. "They're gone for now, but they'll be back with more." The living room was a wreck. The window was gone, the sofa was riddled with holes, and 2 men were slumped against the hallway wall, zip-tied and bleeding. They were young, hardly older than 19, with the same jagged crow tattoo Miguel had seen on the neck of the man at the gas station. Callahan walked over to one of them and grabbed him by the hair, forcing him to look up. "Who sent you? Was it Ruiz?" The boy spat blood on Callahan's boots. "You're dead, old man. All of you. You think you can hide behind a kid? Ruiz is gonna burn this whole block down just to find him." Callahan didn't hit him. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was enough to make the boy flinch. "Ruiz is a businessman, kid. And right now, He's making a bad investment. You tell him that when the police pick you up. Police? Marcus said, looking at Callahan with surprise. Ray, we don't call the cops. I didn't, Callahan said, pointing to the street where sirens were already wailing. The neighbors did. And that's exactly what we need. We need this loud. We need the whole city to see what these punks are doing. As the police arrived and began securing the scene, Callahan pulled Lena and Derek aside. We can't stay here. The apartment is compromised. We need to move them to the clubhouse. The clubhouse. Derek whispered. Ray, the charter rules. Civilians aren't allowed in the back during a red alert status. The rules were written for a different time, Callahan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. This boy saved my life. He's the reason I'm standing here instead of being a charcoal drawing on a parking lot. If the club has a problem with it, they can take it up with me at the table. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you think Callahan is right to break the club's oldest rules to save a stranger? Or is he putting the entire Brotherhood in too much danger? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. The move to the clubhouse was a military operation. They didn't use cars this time. They used the bikes. Callahan put Miguel on the back of his Harley, the boy's small hands gripping the leather of Callahan's vest. Maria was on the back of Lena's bike, her eyes closed tight as the engine roared to life. Riding on the back of a Harley through the streets of Oakland at night was unlike anything Miguel had ever experienced. The wind was a physical force, trying to push him off, but the heat from the engine and the solid presence of Callahan felt like armor. For the first time, Miguel didn't feel like a victim. He felt like he was part of something powerful. He felt the vibration of the road in his bones, a rhythmic hum that seemed to say, "You are alive, you are alive, you are alive." The clubhouse was a fortress of corrugated metal and barbed wire on the edge of the industrial district. As the heavy iron gates swung open and the bikes rolled inside, Miguel saw dozens of men and women standing in the yard. These were the rest of the angels, the ones who hadn't been at the apartment. They looked skeptical. Some looked angry. A man with a gray beard and a massive sergeant-at-arms patch stepped forward. His name was Big Pete, and he looked like he could juggle Volkswagens. "Ray," Pete said, his voice like a landslide. "What the hell are you doing? We heard the news. You brought the Riders' War to our front door for a kid who isn't even a prospect." Callahan dismounted, his boots hitting the gravel with a heavy crunch. He didn't flinch. He walked right up to Big Pete until they were chest to chest. "This kid heard a bomb ticking when we were too busy laughing to notice," Callahan said, his voice carrying across the yard. "He saved my life, Pete. He saved Derek. He saved Lena. If he hadn't spoken up, we'd be burying 3 brothers tomorrow. Now, you tell me, since when do we let people who save our lives get hunted down like dogs?" Pete looked at Miguel, then at Maria, who was shivering next to Lena. The yard was silent. The only sound was the clicking of cooling engines. "The Riders are coming, Ray," Pete said quietly. "They hit the repair shop on 4th Street 10 minutes ago. They're burning everything that has our name on it. They want the boy, or they want our heads." "Then let them come," Callahan said. "We've spent 50 years telling this city that we're the baddest thing on 2 wheels. It's time we proved it." That night, the clubhouse felt less like a social club and more like a war room. Maps were spread out over the pool table. Radios crackled with reports from scouts. Miguel and Maria were given a small room in the back, usually reserved for traveling members. It was clean, but it smelled like stale beer and cigarettes. "Miguel," Maria said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "we should leave. We can go at night. We don't want these people to die for us." "They won't die, Mama," Miguel said, though he wasn't sure. "They're strong. And Callahan, he's different. He said someone helped him once. He's just paying it back." "People don't pay things back in this world, Miko," she whispered. "They only collect debts." Miguel lay awake, listening to the sound of motorcycles circling the perimeter. He thought about the men in the black car. He thought about the jagged crow tattoo. And then, He heard a sound he hadn't expected. It was a soft tapping on the door. He opened it to find Lena standing there. She wasn't wearing her leather vest now. She just had on a black t-shirt that showed the intricate tattoos on her arms. Names of people she'd lost. Dates that meant something only to her. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No," Miguel said. "Come with me. I want to show you something." She led him to the back of the garage, where a row of bikes sat under heavy tarps. She pulled the tarp off a small, vintage dirt bike. It was dusty and hadn't been ridden in years. "This was my brother's," Lena said. "He was a lot like you. Fast, smart, always listening. He didn't make it to 18. The streets got him because he didn't have anyone to watch his back. I'm not letting that happen to you." She handed Miguel a small, silver wrench. "You saved a bike the other day. Now, I'm going to teach you how one works. If you're going to be part of this family, even for a little while, you need to know how to fix what's broken." For the next 3 hours, in the middle of a gang war, a Hell's Angel and a homeless boy sat on the grease-stained floor and talked about pistons, valves, and the courage it takes to keep an engine running. But outside the gates, the darkness was moving. Vincent Ruiz, the leader of the East Bay Riders, was sitting in a warehouse 3 miles away, surrounded by 50 men and a crate of Molotov cocktails. He wasn't interested in respect anymore. He was interested in ashes. "Burn the clubhouse," Ruiz said, lighting a cigarette. "I don't care who's inside. Just bring me the kids' shoes so I can show the city what happens to snitches." The real battle was about to begin, and Miguel Hernandez was about to find out that sometimes the only way to stop the ticking is to face the clock. The warehouse district of Oakland at 3 a.m. is a graveyard of industrial dreams, but inside the Hells Angels clubhouse, the air was vibrating with a heavy, restless energy. The smell of gasoline and cold coffee had become Miguel's new reality. He sat in the corner of the garage, the silver wrench Lena had given him still clutched in his hand. He was watching the brothers prepare. This wasn't the movies. There was no slow-motion gear-up sequence. It was grim, quiet work. Men checked their tire pressure, tightened their primary chains, and spoke in low, clipped tones. They were preparing for a siege, and Miguel felt the crushing weight of guilt settling into his stomach like lead. He looked over at his mother, Maria. She was sitting on a crate near the back exit, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the shadows. Every time the heavy iron gate at the front of the property rattled in the wind, she flinched. Miguel walked over to her, his bare feet, now tucked into a pair of oversized boots Derek had found, clumping loudly on the concrete. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered, sitting at her feet. "I shouldn't have said anything. We could have just walked away." Maria looked at him, her hand trembling as she stroked his hair. "No, Miko. You did what your heart told you. If you had walked away and that man died, you would have carried that fire in your soul forever. I would rather be here, scared, than have a son who watches people burn." Their moment was interrupted by the heavy thud of boots. Callahan approached them, his leather vest looking battle-worn. He had a radio strapped to his belt and a grin set to his jaw. He looked at Maria, then at Miguel. "We've got scouts reporting movement 3 blocks out," Callahan said. "Ruiz isn't coming with bikes. He's coming with trucks. He's trying to play it like a paramilitary strike. He thinks he can overwhelm the gates before we can get our engines hot. Why don't you just give me to them?" Miguel asked suddenly. The words had been burning in his throat for hours. "If I go out there, they'll leave you alone. They'll leave the club alone." The garage went silent. Even Big Pete, who was loading a heavy chain into a saddlebag, stopped to look at the boy. Callahan knelt down, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Listen to me, Miguel," Callahan said, his voice like iron. "In this life, people will tell you that everything has a price. They'll tell you that a life like yours, or a life like your mother's, is worth less than the paint on a car. Those people are liars. Once you start handing people over to save your own skin, you aren't a man anymore. You're just a ghost waiting for the wind to blow you away. We don't hand over family. And like it or not, you're part of the charter now. But I haven't done anything, Miguel protested. I'm just a kid from the street. You gave me it tomorrow, Callahan said simply. That's more than most people ever give. Now, get back to the safe room. Pete is going to stay with you. If things get ugly, there's a crawl space under the floorboards in the office. You go there, and you don't move until you hear my voice. Not Lena's, not Derek's. Mine. Before Miguel could answer, the night was ripped apart by the sound of a shattering explosion. The front gates of the clubhouse groaned as a heavy-duty pickup truck, reinforced with a steel cowcatcher, slammed into them at 40 miles an hour. The sound of twisted metal screamed through the air. Positions. Big Pete roared, his voice booming over the chaos. Miguel and Maria were ushered into the small back office by Derek. Stay down. Derek yelled over his shoulder as he drew a heavy iron pipe and headed back toward the yard. Through the small, reinforced window of the office, Miguel watched the nightmare unfold. The East Bay Riders weren't just street thugs anymore. They were a mob. Dozens of men poured through the gap in the gates, carrying bats, chains, and Molotov cocktails. The first bottle hit a stack of old tires near the fence, and orange flames roared toward the sky, illuminating the yard in a hellish, flickering light. The Hells Angels met them in the center of the yard. It was a clash of eras, the old-school discipline of the motorcycle club against the chaotic, desperate violence of the street gang. Callahan was a whirlwind. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands and a heavy leather belt weighted with a steel buckle. Every move he made was calculated, a lifetime of barroom brawls and street fights distilled into a lethal dance. But there were too many of them. For every rider that went down, two more seemed to climb over the wreckage of the gate. They're going for the bikes. Lena screamed. She was defending the garage entrance, her braid flying behind her as she fended off three men with a heavy wrench. Miguel saw him then. Vincent Ruiz. He wasn't in the thick of the fight. He was standing by the remains of the gate, lit by the fire of the burning tires. He was wearing a pristine white track jacket that looked eerily bright against the soot and smoke. He was smiling. In his hand, he held a flare gun. He pointed it at the roof of the main clubhouse, the place where Miguel and his mother were hiding. No! Miguel screamed, though no one could hear him. The flare arched through the air, a streak of brilliant red that landed on the dry, asphalt-shingled roof. Within seconds, a small lick of flame began to eat at the edges of the building. Inside the office, the air began to grow warm. The smell of smoke started to seep through the vents. "We have to go," Maria whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "Miko, the roof is on fire." Big Pete was at the door, his face covered in soot. "The back way is blocked. They've got a car wedged against the exit. We're trapped in the house." Miguel looked around the office. His mind was racing, the same way it had at the gas station. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for a sound. He heard the roar of the fire, the shouting in the yard, and then he heard it. A low, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum. It wasn't a bike. It was the ventilation system for the underground storage. The vents. Miguel pointed to a heavy iron grate on the floor. "Where does that go?" "That leads to the old sewer line," Pete said, coughing as the smoke thickened. "But it hasn't been opened in 20 years. It's bolted from the underside. I have the wrench," Miguel yelled, pulling the silver tool from his pocket. Pete didn't hesitate. He was a man of action, and right now, the boy was the only one with a plan. He slammed his massive boot into the corner of the grate, creating a small gap. Miguel dropped to his knees, his small hands working with frantic speed. The bolts were rusted, frozen by decades of grime, but Miguel didn't care about the skin peeling off his knuckles. He turned the wrench with every ounce of strength in his small body. Clank. One bolt gave way. Clank. The second one snapped. Outside, the fight had reached a fever pitch. Callahan saw the smoke rising from the clubhouse and let out a roar of pure fury. He broke through the line of riders, ignoring the blows raining down on his back, and sprinted toward the burning building. "Miguel!" Maria, he screamed. But as he reached the door, a wall of fire collapsed inward, blocking the entrance. Callahan tried to plunge through, but Derek and Marcus grabbed him, pulling him back. It's too hot, Ray. You can't go in there. Let me go? They're inside. Callahan struggled. His eyes reflected the destruction of everything he had built. Back in the office, the ceiling was beginning to sag. Hot embers fell like orange snow. Big Pete shoved the grate aside, revealing a dark, narrow shaft that smelled of damp earth and old metal. Go, both of you, Pete ordered. What about you? Maria cried. I'm too big for that hole, lady. I'm going to go out the front and take as many of those bastards with me as I can. Now go. Miguel scrambled into the hole first, his boots slipping on the slick ladder rungs. Maria followed, her breath coming in ragged sobs. As they descended into the darkness, the sound of the world above began to fade, replaced by the dripping of water and the distant echo of their own heartbeats. They crawled through the narrow concrete pipe for what felt like miles. Miguel led the way, his hands feeling the cold, slimy walls. He wasn't afraid of the dark. The dark was where he had lived his whole life. The dark was safe. It was the light that brought the fire. Finally, they reached a heavy iron manhole cover. Miguel pushed, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed again, his muscles screaming. Together, Mama. On 3. They pressed their shoulders against the heavy disc. 1, 2, 3. The cover shifted, sliding across the pavement with a grating shriek. Miguel scrambled out, blinking against the streetlights. They were 2 blocks away from the clubhouse, in a quiet alley behind a bakery. The air was cool and smelled of bread, a jarring contrast to the scent of burning rubber and blood they had just left behind. Miguel looked back. A massive column of black smoke was rising into the sky over the warehouse district. The clubhouse, the fortress, was a pyre. We have to find them, Miguel said. No, Miko, Maria said, grabbing his arm. We have to run. This is our chance. Everyone thinks we died in that fire. We can go to the bus station. We can disappear. Miguel looked at his mother. He saw the terror in her eyes, the years of exhaustion, the weight of a life spent in hiding. He understood why she wanted to run. But then he looked down at the silver wrench still gripped in his hand. He thought of Callahan kneeling in the dirt. He thought of Lena teaching him about engines. He thought of the way they had stood between him and the fire. They didn't run for us, Mama, Miguel said, his voice quiet but steady. I'm not running for them. Before Maria could respond, the sound of a lone motorcycle echoed through the alley. It was a ragged, stumbling sound, an engine on its last legs. A single headlight cut through the darkness, swinging wildly as the bike turned into the alley. The bike skidded to a halt, toppling over as the rider lost strength. Callahan. Miguel ran forward. It wasn't Callahan. It was Derek. His leather vest was scorched, and his face was a mask of blood and soot. He looked at Miguel with wide, disbelieving eyes. You made it, Derek wheezed, clutching his side. Where's Ray? Where's Lena? Derek shook his head slowly. The riders, they regrouped. They've got them cornered at the old docks. Ruiz, he's got Callahan. He wants to make a show of it. He wants to execute the president in front of the whole city. Miguel felt a cold, sharp blade of anger cut through his fear. He looked at the fallen motorcycle. It was Lena's vintage bike, the one he had helped work on just hours before. The fuel line was leaking, and the handlebars were bent. Can it run? Miguel asked. It's shot, kid, Derek said, coughing. The timing is off, and the clutch is gone. Miguel knelt by the bike. He didn't think, he just moved. He saw the disconnected spark plug wire. He saw the crimped fuel line. He used the silver wrench to straighten the metal, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent his life fixing the broken things the world had thrown away. He looked at the ignition. He didn't have a key, but he knew how wires worked. He had watched the men who planted the bomb. He had listened to the tick-tock. He stripped the wires and sparked them together. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, a defiant scream in the quiet alley. "What are you doing?" Maria screamed. "I'm going to the docks," Miguel said, swinging his leg over the seat. He was too small for the bike. His feet barely touched the pegs, but he felt the vibration in his bones. "You'll die, Miguel." "Maybe," Miguel said, looking at his mother one last time. "But I won't be a ghost." He twisted the throttle, and the bike surged forward. As Miguel raced toward the docks, the wind whipping through his hair, he knew he was walking into the mouth of the lion. But he also knew something Vincent Ruiz didn't. He knew that the smallest gear can stop the biggest machine if it's placed in the right spot. And Miguel Hernandez was ready to be that gear. The docks were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and crane shadows. At the very end of Pier 14, under a single, buzzing floodlight, Vincent Ruiz stood over a kneeling Raymond Callahan. Callahan's hands were tied behind his back, but his head was up, his eyes fixed on Ruiz with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Any last words, Ray?" Ruiz asked, pulling a chrome-plated pistol from his waistband. "Something for the history books?" "Yeah," Callahan spat. "You're late." "Late for what?" From the shadows of the containers, the sound of a screaming engine erupted. A small bike, trailing sparks and smoke, flew off a loading ramp and landed 10 feet from Ruiz. Ruiz spun around, his eyes wide. "What the—" The boy on the bike didn't stop. He headed straight for the line of gas cans the riders had lined up to burn the docks. "Don't start the engine!" Miguel screamed at the top of his lungs, though the engine was already roaring. But he wasn't talking to the bike. He was talking to the trap he had seen the moment he arrived. The docks were a landscape of jagged steel and rotting wood, and the air smelled of salt and impending death. Vincent Ruiz stared at the small figure on the oversized bike, his mouth hanging open in a mix of confusion and mounting rage. He had spent the last hour celebrating the destruction of the Hells Angels, convinced that the boy had perished in the inferno of the clubhouse. Seeing Miguel now, appearing like a vengeful spirit from the smoke, felt like a glitch in reality. "The kid," Ruiz hissed, his grip tightening on the chrome pistol. "How are you even breathing?" Miguel didn't answer with words. He kept the throttle pinned, the vintage engine screaming in a pitch it was never meant to sustain. He wasn't riding toward Ruiz to tackle him. He was riding toward the weak point. Beside the shipping containers sat a massive industrial generator that powered the pier's heavy cranes. The riders had tapped into their fuel line to fill their gas cans, leaving a shimmering puddle of diesel across the concrete. "Stop him!" Ruiz screamed at his men. 2 riders lunged for the bike, but Miguel was too small and too fast. He leaned the bike low, the footpegs scraping sparks against the pavement. Those sparks hit the diesel puddle just as Miguel swerved away. A wall of blue and orange flame erupted between Ruiz and the kneeling Callahan, creating a temporary curtain of fire. In the chaos, Miguel skidded to a halt near Callahan. He didn't have a knife to cut the heavy zip ties, but he had something better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver wrench. With a desperate, practiced motion, he jammed the thin handle of the wrench into the locking mechanism of the ties and twisted with every ounce of his weight. Snap! Callahan's hands were free. He didn't waste a second. He surged upward like a golem made of granite, his fist connecting with the jaw of the nearest rider before the man could even raise his chain. "Get behind the container, Miguel!" Callahan roared, grabbing a discarded iron pipe from the ground. The pier turned into a slaughterhouse of shadows. The fire Miguel had started was spreading, catching on the old wooden pilings of the dock. The East Bay riders were panicked, their formation broken by the sudden shift in momentum. They were used to being the ones holding the gun. They weren't used to a man like Raymond Callahan when he had nothing left to lose. But Ruiz wasn't a coward. He stepped through the smoke, his white jacket now stained with soot, and leveled his pistol at Callahan's chest. "It ends here, Ray. No more games. No more kids saving your hide." "Then pull the trigger, Vincent," Callahan said, stepping toward him, his voice dangerously calm. But know this, every angel in the state is on their way. You didn't just burn a house tonight. You woke up the hive. Ruiz's finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, a heavy, metallic thud echoed from the water behind him. A police boat, its spotlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of God, roared into view. The blue and red lights washed over the pier, illuminating the dozens of Hell's Angels who had survived the clubhouse fire and were now swarming the entrance of the docks on their bikes. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a few bikes. It was the sound of 100. The cavalry had arrived. "Drop the weapon," a voice boomed over a megaphone from the water. Ruiz looked at the police boat, then at the wall of leather and chrome fast approaching from the land, and then at Callahan. He knew the math. Even if he killed Callahan, he wouldn't make it off the pier alive. In a final, desperate act of spite, he didn't aim at Callahan. He swung the barrel toward the boy hiding behind the shipping container. "If I'm going down, the snitch goes with me," Ruiz snarled. Crack. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the roar of the incoming bikes. Miguel felt a sharp, stinging heat across his shoulder. He tumbled backward, his head hitting the steel container with a hollow ring. Darkness threatened to pull him under, but he fought it. He heard Callahan let out a sound of pure, unbridled rage, a roar that drowned out the sirens. Callahan didn't wait for the police. He tackled Ruiz, the two men crashing through a wooden railing and plummeting into the dark, churning waters of the Oakland estuary. "Ray!" Lena's voice screamed. She was the first to reach the end of the pier, jumping off her bike before it even stopped moving. She ran to Miguel, her hands fluttering over his shoulder. "Miguel, talk to me." I'm okay," Miguel whispered, his voice shaking. The bullet had only grazed the meat of his shoulder, but the shock was overwhelming. "Where's Callahan?" "He went into the water." Lena looked over the edge. The water was a black void, broken only by the churning foam where the two men had disappeared. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing. No movement. No sound but the distant sirens. Then, a hand gripped the edge of a floating timber. Callahan emerged, gasping for air, his face bruised and bleeding. He was alone. "Where is he?" Derek asked, helping pull the president back onto the pier. Callahan didn't answer immediately. He sat on the wet wood, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands, then at Miguel. He didn't come up. The current, it took him under the pilings. The silence that followed was heavy. The leader of the East Bay Riders was gone, washed away by the same tide that brought the ships into the harbor. The war was over, but the cost was etched into the faces of everyone standing on that pier. The police moved in, but the Angels stood in a solid line, a wall of leather that the officers were hesitant to push through. They weren't looking for a fight with the cops tonight. They were looking for their own. "We need a medic," Lena yelled, her arm wrapped tightly around Miguel. As the paramedics loaded Miguel into the back of an ambulance, he saw his mother running down the pier. Maria had hitched a ride with one of the club's prospects, her face a mask of tears and relief. She threw herself into the ambulance, clutching Miguel so hard he winced. "You're alive," she sobbed. "Gracias a Dios, you're alive." Callahan walked over to the ambulance. He looked like he had been through a war because he had. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. It was the wrench Miguel had used to save him. "You dropped this," Callahan said, placing it in Miguel's hand. "Keep it. It's the most important tool in this city." He looked at Maria. "I promised you he'd be safe. I'm sorry it got this far." Maria looked at the man who had nearly died for her son, and then at the boy who had done the same for him. She didn't see a criminal anymore. She saw a man bound by a code that was older and deeper than any law book. She reached out and touched Callahan's arm. "You kept your word, Senor Callahan. That is more than most." The next few days were a blur of hospital hallways and police statements. The Oakland PD knew they couldn't tie the Angels to the dock fire without a fight, and with the East Bay Riders effectively dismantled, They were content to let the motorcycle club business stay within the club. Miguel's injury was minor, a flesh wound that would leave a scar he'd eventually wear with pride. But the club was in ruins. The clubhouse was a black skeleton of ash and twisted metal. The bikes, the history, the sanctuary, it was all gone. A week after the fire, the charter met in a vacant lot behind the charred remains of their home. There were no chairs, no pool table, just a circle of motorcycles with their headlights facing inward. Callahan stood in the center of the light. "We lost everything," Callahan said, his voice carrying in the night air. "But we're still standing, and we have a new debt to settle." He signaled to Derek, who drove a small, nondescript van into the center of the circle. When the back doors opened, Miguel and Maria stepped out. They looked nervous, standing in the glare of 50 high beams. "The clubhouse is gone," Callahan continued. "But the club is the people. And these two, they're people. Marcus, you got something to say?" Marcus stepped forward. He looked at Miguel for a long time, his arms crossed over his massive chest. "I said you were a liability, kid. I said you weren't worth the heat." He paused, a small, begrudging smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I was wrong. You got more copper in your blood than most men I know. If Ray says you stay, you stay." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. "But staying isn't enough," Callahan said. "Miguel, come here." Miguel walked into the center of the circle. Callahan handed him a heavy envelope. "This is from the national chapter. It's enough to get you and your mom an apartment in a better part of town. Real lease. Real names. We've got a lawyer who's already filed the paperwork for your mother's residency. No more hiding in the dark." Maria gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Why? Why would you do this?" "Because you're not guests anymore," Callahan said. He looked at Miguel and then reached into a bag at his feet. He pulled out a leather vest. It didn't have the death head on the back, not yet. But on the front, over the heart, was a small patch that read, "Protector." "In our world, we have ranks," Callahan explained. "But tonight, we're making a new one. You save the president. You save the club. This patch means that as long as there is a Hell's Angel in Oakland, you and your mother have a home. You're under our wing. Always." As Miguel put on the vest, it still felt a little heavy, a little too big. But as he looked around at the circle of brothers and sisters, he didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like he finally had a heartbeat that belonged. But the transition from the street to a new life wouldn't be as simple as a new apartment and a leather vest. There were still shadows in Oakland, and not everyone was happy with the Hells Angels' new family. Someone was watching from the edge of the lot. Someone who hadn't forgotten the fire at the docks. Someone who believed that the only way to truly kill a bird of prey was to clip its wings while it was trying to build a nest. The final test was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be fought with wrenches or fire. It would be fought in the one place Miguel never thought he'd have to go back to, the truth. The transition from the concrete floor of a warehouse to a two-bedroom apartment in a quiet corner of East Oakland felt like waking up in a different dimension. For the first time in his life, Miguel had a door he could lock from the inside that wasn't hiding him from the law. He had a window that looked out onto a small lemon tree instead of a trash-strewn alley. But the silence of a safe life was louder than the chaos of the streets. It took him weeks to stop jumping at the sound of a car backfiring. Every time a heavy engine rumbled down their new street, his hand instinctively went to the silver wrench he now kept on a shelf above his bed like a holy relic. The Hells Angels didn't just give them a place to live, they gave them a presence. Every morning, a different member of the club would roll by just to check in. Sometimes it was Derek, his arms still in a sling, bringing a bag of groceries. Sometimes it was Lena who would sit with Maria and help her navigate the mountain of legal paperwork for her residency. They weren't just protectors, they were a constant, living reminder that the debt of a life saved is never truly settled. It just evolves. "You're going to school on Monday," Callahan said one afternoon as he sat at their new kitchen table, looking strangely out of place next to a bowl of fresh fruit. Miguel looked up from a textbook Lena had bought him. School? I haven't been in a classroom since the 4th grade, Ray. I'll be the oldest kid in the room who doesn't know anything. You know more about survival than any teacher in this city, Callahan grunted, tapping his thick fingers on the table. But survival isn't a career. The club is handling the tuition for a private vocational school. They have a mechanics program. You want to work on bikes? You're going to learn how to do it right. No more stripped wires and luck. You're going to learn the science of the machine. Maria came over and placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder. Her face had regained a color he hadn't seen in years. The hollow circles under her eyes were fading. It is a gift, Miko. A chance to be someone the world can't ignore. Miguel nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the docks. He was thinking about the way Vincent Ruiz had disappeared into the black water. The police had never found a body. The official report said the current had likely dragged him out to the bay, but in the back of Miguel's mind, the ticking hadn't stopped. It had just changed its rhythm. As the weeks turned into months, Miguel began to adapt. He was a natural in the shop at school. His hands, once used for scavenging and hiding, were now famous for their precision. He could listen to an engine and tell you exactly which valve was sticking before he even opened the casing. The teachers called it a gift. The angels called it the ear. But the piece was fragile. One evening, as Miguel was walking home from the bus stop, he noticed a familiar sensation, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the heavy, obvious presence of the club. This was something colder. He turned the corner toward his apartment and saw a man standing under the lemon tree. The man was thin, his clothes hanging off a frame that looked like it had been chewed on by the city. He wasn't wearing a leather vest or a track jacket. He was wearing the uniform of the forgotten, a tattered coat and a distant, hungry stare. "You're the boy," the man whispered as Miguel approached. Miguel tensed, his hand sliding into his backpack where he kept the silver wrench. "Who are you?" "I'm a message," the man said, his voice raspy. "Ruiz didn't go to the bay. He went to the basement. And the basement is getting crowded, Miguel." The man handed him a small, crumpled piece of paper and disappeared into the shadows before Miguel could ask another question. Miguel opened the paper under the glow of the porch light. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph. It was a picture of the convenience store where it all began, but someone had drawn a red circle around the spot where Miguel used to sleep. Underneath, in jagged, shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Time is up." Miguel didn't call Callahan. He didn't call Lena. A part of him, the part that had lived on the streets for a decade, told him that this was a ghost he had to face alone. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, the old fear creeping back into his bones. He realized that the Hells Angels could protect him from a gang. They could protect him from the police, but they couldn't protect him from the past. The next morning, Miguel didn't go to school. He took the bus back to the old neighborhood. It looked different now. The warehouse district was being cleared out, the charred remains of the clubhouse hidden behind high construction fences. He walked to the convenience store. The neon sign was still buzzing, that same low-frequency hum that had been the soundtrack to his life. He stood on the sidewalk, looking at the black asphalt where the Harley had once sat. "Looking for a heartbeat?" a voice asked. Miguel spun around. Standing by the gas pumps was a man he didn't recognize at first. He was older, his hair white, and his face a map of deep, painful scars. He was leaning on a cane, his left leg dragging slightly. It took Miguel a moment to see past the damage. The eyes were the same. The cold, calculating eyes of Vincent Ruiz. "You're alive," Miguel breathed. "Barely," Ruiz said, his voice a wet rattle. "The pilings under that dock are covered in barnacles, kid. They cut like razors. The water tried to swallow me, but I've been swallowed by better things than the Oakland estuary." Ruiz stepped closer, the tap of his cane rhythmic on the concrete. Tap, 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 like a clock. "I lost my crew. I lost my territory. I lost my face," Ruiz said, gesturing to the scars. "The police think I'm dead, and the Hells Angels think they won. But I'm still here. And as long as I'm here, you're just a borrowed life. Why tell me? Miguel asked, his voice steadying. Why not just kill me? Because killing you is too easy, Ruiz hissed. I want you to know that every time you start an engine, every time you walk through a door, every time you look at that woman you call a mother, I'm the one who decided you could. I'm the ghost in your machine, Miguel. I'm the tick in your talk. Ruiz turned and began to limp away, melting into the morning fog of the industrial district. Miguel stood there, the silver wrench heavy in his pocket. He realized that Ruiz wasn't there to fight. He was there to infect him. He wanted to take away the one thing the Hells Angels had given him, peace. Miguel went home that night and sat on the porch. When Callahan's bike roared up the street for the evening check-in, Miguel didn't hide the paper. He handed it to the president. Callahan read the note, his face turning into a mask of cold fury. Where did you get this? He's alive, Ray. I saw him today. Callahan didn't shout. He didn't call for backup. He just sat down on the porch step next to Miguel. I knew it, he whispered. I felt it in the water that night. He was too angry to drown. What do we do? Miguel asked. Do we hunt him down? No. Callahan said, looking at the lemon tree. That's what he wants. He wants us to turn back into monsters. He wants to drag us back into the mud so he can feel normal again. If we hunt him, we prove he's still important. We prove he still has power over us. So we just let him watch us. We do better than that, Callahan said, standing up. We live so well it kills him. We build that clubhouse back. We get your mom her citizenship. We get you through that school. We make him watch us succeed until the bitterness is the only thing he has left to eat. Callahan put a hand on Miguel's shoulder. He's a ghost, Miguel. And ghosts only have power if you're afraid of the dark. Are you afraid of the dark? Miguel looked at his hands, the hands of a mechanic, a protector, a son. He thought about the ticking sound. He realized that the ticking wasn't a bomb anymore. It was a heartbeat. No, Miguel said. I'm not afraid. But the shadow of Ruiz wasn't the only thing lurking. Within the club itself, the cost of the war was being tallied. The national chapter was asking questions. Why was the Oakland charter spending so much on a civilian family? Why was the clubhouse being rebuilt with a community center attached to it? Marcus and Big Pete were standing by Callahan, but the younger members, the ones who hadn't seen the bomb, were whispering. They saw the money going to lawyers and tuition instead of new bikes and business. The internal clock was ticking now. A challenge was coming for Callahan's leadership, and Miguel Hernandez was the centerpiece of the argument. The final battle wouldn't be on the docks or in the streets. It would be at the table, the sacred meeting place of the Hells Angels, where the fate of the Oakland charter would be decided once and for all. And Miguel, the boy who heard the tick-tock, was about to find out if he was truly a part of the family or just a beautiful mistake. The air inside the new, temporary meeting hall was thick with the scent of unwashed denim and heavy tobacco. This wasn't the polished apartment or the quiet school workshop. This was the belly of the beast. For the first time, Miguel stood outside the double doors of the room, the place where the Hells Angels conducted their most private business. He could hear the low, rumbling thunder of voices inside, men debating the future of the Oakland charter, and more specifically, the future of the boy who had brought a war to their doorstep. Maria stood beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She shouldn't have been there, but Callahan had insisted. If they're going to talk about your life, he had said, you're going to be there to look them in the eye. The doors swung open, and the sound of the room hit Miguel like a physical wave. 50 men in leather vests sat around a massive, rough-hewn redwood table. At the head sat Raymond Callahan, his face a stoic mask. To his left was Marcus, looking grimmer than usual, and to his right sat a man Miguel didn't know, a representative from the national chapter with nomad stitched across his chest and eyes like cold flint. The issue isn't the boy's courage, the nomad said, his voice cutting through the room. The issue is resources. We are a motorcycle club, not a social service agency. We've spent 6 figures on legal fees, medical bills, and protection for 2 people who aren't even patched. The East Bay Riders are gone, but they took our clubhouse with them. The brothers are asking, when does the charity end? A younger member, a man named Jax with a fresh tattoo on his neck, stood up. He's right, Ray. We're losing street cred. People think we've gone soft. They see us escorting a kid to school, and they laugh. We need to focus on the business. Give the kid a final payout and let them move to another state. It's for their safety and ours. Callahan didn't move. He let the murmurs of agreement swell and then die down. He looked at Miguel, then at the nomad. You call it charity, Callahan said, his voice vibrating in the floorboards. I call it an investment in the soul of this club. We tell the world we're a brotherhood. We tell them we live by a code. But a code is just words on a wall if you don't live it when it's hard. This boy didn't ask us for a dime. He ran toward a bomb to save men who didn't even know his name. If we turn our backs on that, then what are we? Just another gang? Just another group of thugs with louder engines. He's a civilian, Ray, the nomad countered. He's not one of us. Isn't he? Lena's voice rang out from the back of the room. She stepped forward, her protector patch visible. He fixed my brother's bike with a hand-me-down wrench while the building was burning. He stood on the docks while Ruiz had a gun to his head, and he didn't blink. I've seen prospects with 5 years on the road who don't have half the heart of this kid. The room erupted into a heated debate, voices clashing like gears. Miguel felt the familiar urge to run, to disappear back into the shadows where no one debated his worth. But then he felt the weight of the silver wrench in his pocket. He thought about the tick-tock. He realized that the club was facing its own kind of bomb, an internal one that could tear them apart from the inside. Without thinking, Miguel stepped forward. He walked right up to the edge of the redwood table. The room went dead silent. Even the nomad leaned back, surprised by the boy's audacity. I don't want your money, Miguel said, his voice clear and steady. And I don't want you to fight my wars. You gave me a home when I was a ghost. You gave my mother a name. That's more than I can ever pay back. He pulled the silver wrench from his pocket and set it on the table. It looked small and humble against the heavy rings and scarred wood. But if you think being soft is protecting people who can't protect themselves, then maybe you aren't as tough as you think you are, Miguel said. The men who planted that bomb weren't afraid of your bikes or your patches. They were afraid of your loyalty. They thought they could break it. If you walk away from me now, you're letting them win. You're telling Ruiz that he was right, that everyone has a price. Callahan stood up slowly. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every man at the table. The boy is right. We don't rebuild the clubhouse with bricks and mortar. We rebuild it with respect. We're opening the community center. We're keeping the mechanics program. And anyone who has a problem with that can leave their patch on this table right now. Silence stretched across the room, heavy and suffocating. Marcus was the first to move. He stood up, walked to the table, and placed his heavy hand next to Miguel's wrench. I'm in, he grunted. One by one, the brothers stood. Derek, Lena, Big Pete, even the younger members who had been whispering. The nomad looked at the sea of leather and the small boy at the center of it. He let out a long, slow breath and nodded. The Oakland charter stands. But the heat is on you, Callahan. Don't make us regret this. The meeting broke up, but the work was just beginning. Over the next year, the new Oakland clubhouse rose from the ashes. It was different this time. A fortress, yes, but one with an open door. The front section became a vocational workshop where kids from the street could learn a trade without being recruited into a gang. Miguel was the first graduate of the program. He didn't just learn to fix bikes, he learned to lead. Maria became the heart of the kitchen. Her dining skills transformed into a catering business that served the whole neighborhood. She received her official residency papers on a Tuesday in July. The entire Oakland charter showed up at the courthouse, a line of 50 Harleys idling outside in a thunderous salute as she walked out, a legal citizen of the country she had lived in for so long as a shadow. But there was still one ghost left. On the day of the new clubhouse's grand opening, Miguel took a ride on the vintage dirt bike Lena had given him. He rode down to the docks, back to Pier 14. The wood was still charred in places, a permanent scar on the waterfront. He sat on the edge of the pier, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of bruised purple and gold. "I knew you'd come back," a voice rasped from the shadows. Vincent Ruiz stepped out from behind a rusted crane. He looked worse than before, thinner, his skin a sallow gray, the scars on his face puckered and raw. He held a small knife in his hand, but his grip was shaking. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by his own hate. "I've been watching you, Miguel," Ruiz said. "I saw the party. I saw the bikes. You think you've won." Miguel didn't stand up. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just looked at the man who had tried to destroy his life. "I haven't won anything, Vincent. I just stopped running. You're the only one left in the race." "I could end it right now," Ruiz said, taking a staggering step forward. "I could take the protector out before the sun goes down." "Then do it," Miguel said, turning back to the water. "But look around you. There's no one here to see it. No crew. No territory. No legacy. If you kill me, you're just a dying man in a dark alley. But if you walk away, you might find something else to live for." Ruiz stared at Miguel's back. He looked at the leather vest, the steady shoulders of a boy who had become a man. He saw the protector patch and realized it wasn't just a title. It was a shield. The Hell's Angels weren't just protecting Miguel. Miguel was protecting the hope that things could be different. Ruiz's hand dropped. The knife clattered onto the wooden boards. He didn't say another word. He turned and limped back into the fog, a ghost finally fading into the night. Miguel never saw him again. When Miguel returned to the clubhouse, the party was in full swing. The music was loud, the grill was smoking, and the laughter of the brothers and sisters filled the air. Callahan was standing by the entrance, a glass of water in his hand, watching the scene with a rare, genuine smile. "Where have you been, kid?" Callahan asked as Miguel parked his bike. "Just checking the perimeter, Ray," Miguel said, wiping a smudge of grease from his hand. "Everything's quiet." Callahan clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Because tomorrow we've got work to do. There's a new shipment of engines coming in, and I want you leading the teardown." Miguel looked at the clubhouse, the home that had been built on a foundation of tick-tock and silver wrenches. He looked at his mother laughing with Lena and Marcus showing a group of neighborhood kids how to change a tire. He realized that the sound he had heard all those months ago wasn't just a bomb. It was the sound of a world shifting. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver wrench. It was cold, solid, and real. "I'm ready, Ray," Miguel said. As the moon rose over Oakland, the roar of 100 engines filled the night, a sound that used to mean terror, but now, for a boy named Miguel, it sounded like a lullaby. The street rat was gone. The ghost was dead. The protector was home. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If Miguel's story reminded you that even the smallest voice can stop a disaster, please hit that subscribe button and give us a like. We are a family here, and your support is what keeps our engines running. Tell us in the comments, what's the one thing you'd fight for no matter the cost? We can't wait to read your stories. Until next time, keep your ears open and your heart steady. Ride safe.